going back and thinking about the project that Marian's mentioned, we came together as a group, the poet group, because we had this common interest in transitions, and we'd met really as we went to conferences around Europe, and decided that we ought to do something like write together. And you may know the book, what is its title? Transitions in the Early Years, Debating Continuity and Progression, that came out way back in 2002, that Hilary Fabian and I edited. And some of the speakers today are in that book, and others were in our next book. So these are that was the start of bringing some of that work together. And we got to the point, we thought, oh, well, we've written together, it's time we actually shared our research. And that was what led to the European project. They gave us this wonderful opportunity to travel and to meet and to work together for periods of time, and it really has been so exciting. And out of that, you begin to think a bit more about what transitions might mean to you, why you're researching in the first place. And I had a question from my husband one time. I think it was when we were heading off to New Zealand for the last work package. And Robin said to me, "You're not still researching transitions, are you?" And he was a design tutor, and he's very practical, and he doesn't get the research bit at all. And I said, well, we are, but people have been doing it for 50 years. And it raises a huge question, actually. It's a really good question. Why are we still researching transitions? Why haven't we got all that right in practice? Why haven't we, have we been able to move the research through, but it's just different generations of practitioners coming through? And no job, I've been around long enough to know that no job in early childhood is ever done. You know, you kind of do it for a while, and then you get onto something else, and then you're round to the next priority. And I see people smiling and recognising that. It's how it is, isn't it? So we did early intervention, we did language for life, we did, and we're back to literacy and numeracy, and so on. And believe you me, when you get to retiral stage, we'll still be doing those things. So I wanted to focus, please, if I don't start on the slides, we'll be here all day. I wanted to focus on these things. The idea that transitions matter. And I think if you all took a moment to think, what have been the transitions in your life? What was the most recent one? For a start, I know Joanne and Katya had long waits at airports. It's awful. And you kind of transition into being a sheep, because nobody tells you anything much. And, then you have to be a real person again when you come out the other side. So I think we could label many experiences transitions, but there are some quite obvious ones. And I like that Marian said we'd moved beyond just the transitions to school, although in my presentation you'll see that actually is the area that is most researched, that school start. But it's time we went way back to transitions to parenthood, for example, or out of education. So I think they matter. I think there's that idea that after 50 years of research, and I'll take you back to that beginning, there are still many issues to resolve, and that might be generational. But I think what has come out most strongly from me, and hence the name of what we're doing, has been the idea that when I started out, transitions were viewed quite negatively. It was, we better prepare everybody and help them manage, and they'll cope, and of course, build their resilience and sustain their well-being. But it was kind of, what do they not know that they need to know? And I think we really have to flip that and say, here's a superb opportunity. I'm looking at you, Jackie. That transition that we've talked about and people will be seeing later in self-confidence, for example, amongst women with young children, and perceiving their role as something really positive. So I think it works in all sorts of ways. And I think in Scotland, and I know Marian will say something about this, we need to plug that continuity that we have the possibility of with our curriculum for the early level. So, next slide, please. So how do you define it? Well, I'm not going to read everything that's on the slides, but I do want to say to you that our presentations will be available online in due course. So anything that you see on the slide, you will get eventually. And I think this one is pretty much there and intact, and I'm not going to change a lot before you see it again. Some of the earliest definitions came from work with families. Isn't that interesting? Before education cottoned onto it, really. And so Cowan, there are two Cowans, but I really like what they say about we view transitions as occurring when there are qualitative shifts in the individual self-concept and worldview, major life roles and central relationships. So those key things that are there, self-concept, worldview, how you feel about the world, what you take on in your life, and your relationships. And I would say transitions must be relational. When Hilary and I did that first book, we thought, well, it's a dynamic time of change. We were already thinking about this should be positive. But I see that we said there were accelerated developmental demands, and that fits with the research model we were using, which was from Bronfenbrenner and the ecological systems and what he calls the proximal processes. So that there is this kind of, it's not a hiatus, it's a space in which all sorts of new things can happen because there's change. And I think children feel that when they make a step into a new setting. My mentor, Helen Marwick, always reminds me of the psychology and says Bronfenbrenner doesn't really do it. You've got to look at transactional analysis and you've got to look at Samaroff. And he says about the times that children are exposed and have new developmental trajectories. And I could quote Hilary, but I'm quoting Anders Garpelin, who was in our Poet Project. He used work from anthropology from Van Gennep, who way back studied in Timor and East Indies, I think. And he talks about the threshold, so that you might be on the threshold of something new. And I think that's why we mark that for children. Whilst we're trying to be positive, we're trying to have them understand what they're letting go and what they're going on to. And we do that variously, and sometimes well and sometimes not so well. But a kind of borderland, and that's like the spaces again, isn't it? It's that possibility that there's a space that we can do something different in. Thanks, Mary. So this, I certainly won't read blow by blow. I did a review for Oxford Education, and you might like, it's called an Oxford Bibliography. Val did one. What was yours on, Val?
Early childhood education in Europe.
Yeah. So there's lots of sources, but they're beginning to clock into early childhood more. And I think it's probably a subscription. But if you ever start doing a bit of study, you get a fabulous lead into the literature. So I worked and worked. I don't know how long yours took you, but I think you were finished before me. I think you may be commissioned before me, I don't know. But there are thousands and thousands and thousands of articles about transition. So that again begs the question, why are we still researching it? What's happening to all those articles? So the task was to look at the history, look at the key textbooks, look at the literature reviews, look at the policy, and then do anything you liked. And you could pick a number of topics, and you had to do select 8 only references under each topic. You had to have read everything. I ended up with 136 that I selected out of the many I read. And you'll see the themes I developed from it. And it's not everything. It really isn't. But it's my take. And if they ever ask me to edit it again, I think I might hand it to somebody else. But way back in the UK, we had Cleve, and they did National Foundation for Educational Research project, 1982. I was teaching then. And we were concerned about children moving on. We didn't know how well the nursery bit was received in school. And there wasn't a lot of continuity. There was probably more discontinuity. And so she identifies those things. And children used to cry at the door because maybe nursery was the first thing they'd done out of the home. And I don't think we see that so much now. Is that right? You do sometimes have a distressed child, but maybe we don't need it if we're doing the job well. At about the same time, we had a Scottish study. And I don't know if people remember Joyce Watt at all, but she had that wonderful phrase, which was continuity without sameness, change without shock. So we do want things to change. We don't want it to be samey. But it's how we do that in ways that is familiar for the children as well. And then a big American researcher, Pianta, and his school, lots of different materials. He's produced something called CLASS, which is looking at early childhood environments in nursery and in early primary. Very useful work to have a take on. Belsky, sometimes I get cross with, and then I came across this, and he was challenging the school readiness concept way back in 1994. And still it regurgitates. We're not about getting children ready for school. We might be about getting them ready for transition. But we have to value this phase of 3 to 6 and make it as continuous as possible. And our systems actually interrupt it. Then there's general overviews as well. And the one that I want to really point you to, which is the 50-year mark, I think, Kagan and Neumann, when they published that article, spoke about the previous 30 years of research they had that was going on in transitions. So they were going back to the late 1950s. And actually, one of the best definitions comes from Dewey, who was writing 1938-ish. And I'll share that with you when I find it on my notes. But that weaving of continuity and transitions, Beth Grau in America says, don't worry about the term school readiness, it just means transitions. But we would argue it doesn't. It's different. Several highlights from them and the importance of continuity. And actually, Lynn Kagan, who's doing a new book with Sally and me, she's very much about structures and time we changed our systems. And she's globetrotting, telling people that's what they need to do. They need to think about systems. And I think in Scotland we got this gift of our early level curriculum that Marion will talk about that we really need to work on. That raises questions, really. How is it for families? And quite a few of our presentations today are around family experience, and I think that's really strong. Some are more about pedagogy and working with families. But, we have all sorts of different kinds of families. And I know this baby up on the right, that's my nephew. And he and his partner are two daddies. And, families change, and we need to acknowledge that. And how is it for children? And of course, as a granny, can't resist. Guess which are mine. But children are in many different circumstances, aren't they? So this is the little guy who's become a big brother in Australia 2 days ago. But island families, up on Isla, also a family who wrote about that experience in a recent chapter called Curriculum as a Gift, I think. But, lots and lots of different experiences, from the kids out in the street one hot summer around the corner from me in Govan Hill with an old wardrobe, a bedhead, some juice. But the thing that was different from my home visiting days in Craigmillar in Edinburgh was they had a book, and the older child was reading to the younger ones. And I turned the clock back in my head and I thought 30 years ago I wouldn't have seen that. And that was just delightful. So, also, how is it for us as practitioners? Oh, and I've lost a lovely banner that was across the bottom. But hey, have a look at that middle picture and tell me what I need to do about it. And I hope you're not from that nursery. I'm in my park walking my dogs most mornings, and I see these trucks of children going around, and it worries me hugely. They can't see out if the hoods are up. They can see each other if the hoods are down. The bigger ones get to walk, but they're on leading reins. And all I can do is stand from a distance and take a long shot and think to myself, what am I going to do about this? So I thought, will I show the slide? But what is that? That's not outdoor play, but you could tick the box. Next one, please. So these were the themes that I had identified in this huge literature. And I think they're interesting, and I think they overlap often. But there were the things that I felt I really need to draw out. So the whole ethics of, I think we have an ethic of practice anyway, don't we? It's a sort of moral code about how you work with children and families. But it's absolutely essential in research as well that we take an ethical approach. There's the importance of family engagement. Children's perspectives are an interesting one. I'm still teasing out in my head how much we interpret their perspectives and how much we really get to what they think and say. And Kate will be talking about that later today. So you can see a pile of them, and I've given Into Temptation, and I did in the document, talking about school readiness, I put transitions readiness. But these references are from babies through to 8-year-olds. So there's quite a lot of material in there covering all sorts of different aspects of practice. And continuity and discontinuity are probably the two biggest, most written about issues. Continuity is no good at all if it's not high quality. So don't punt it if what children are coming from to you is low quality. Think of discontinuity for that, and think of what children need. But I mean, in an ideal world, we would have high quality and that little bit of change that Joyce Watt talks about. So I've only picked 3 of them, you'll be glad to say. I'm not going to work down all of them. But I think multiple perspectives comes out for me, and that's why I showed the How Is It for Children, Families practitioners. We really need to think from a whole lot of different lenses how people experience transitions and what's going on in the lives of the parents of the children we work with. These are not our children. They belong in families and communities, and what is it like for them within that experience? So in there's families, there's different kinds of continuities. I've named some that are visible in the literature: poverty, divorce, mobility, changing views of childhood, a mismatch of cultural values between the home and the nursery, the home and the school, between parents and practitioners, the imperative for father engagement that we're still not very good at, and Joanne and I were talking about that last night. How do you get the dads in? So many different issues there. And then my next one is continuity and discontinuity. It has to be. And you'll note that in everything that's there, there's a pedagogy of dialogue. I love that paper. It's from Eastern Europe, and it's a beautiful paper. Stig Brostrom, with all his investigation of children and families and children's perspectives, and the bridging the gap, and it was Stig who talked about feeling suitable in school. Feeling suitable. And we decided not to edit the English because it was such a beautiful phrase. Feeling suitable in school, feeling suitable in nursery, feeling suitable wherever you are, because that's your resilience and your well-being and your jumping off point. I like this paper, DeSanto and Berman, advocating a move from a developmentalist view of children, and we do punt child development as a knowledge base. And I'm not saying that's wrong, we need that understanding, but we need to step up beyond that and see children in socio-cultural terms as part of their context. Development is hugely powerful, but it's not the only thing going on. It's how we enhance that. And actually I read a book by Richard Plomin about DNA, and he says actually you can forget about environment. It's all there in the DNA. And then he comes back and he says, I'm expressing that so that you know what you're up against with DNA. Okay, so a thought. And I wanted to finish there with my own work and with Marian's, because there's been good work around the early level about Scotland, so you need to read that too. I think there are some... Oh, I've got a policy one I forgot about. Okay, well, I think I'd probably point you not only to what we're doing in Scotland with having transitions in our self-evaluation indicators, but what New Zealand does. Always from a distance, they look wonderful. And I'm saying from a distance because you've taken me to many places in New Zealand and I've seen some of the best practice in the world. But it's not universal either, is it? Just like it's not here. So when you read about Reggio, or you read about Te Variki, or you read about anybody's exemplary curriculum, have a wee think that that's the best of the best. And there's still work to do underneath that. We've got a new OECD report. Marion proofread it for them, I think. We might have some remarks to make. We have strong stuff from UNICEF. You might be interested in the idea of a transition summit. One day that might be a good thing to have and see where we've got to. And thanks, next one. And then that leads me to what I think are kind of contested issues. So there's often dichotomies in transitions. So single or multiple, continuous or discontinuous, readiness or lack of it, resilience or vulnerability, agency or lack of control, being visible or being silenced. And I think they need to be understood for their lifelong implications. So I end up, and this is where longitudinal study comes in, saying, well, okay, I'd said early childhood's not about preparation for school, but it is about the beginning of life and how you set out on your life journey. And we need to know the impact of what we do in early childhood and early primary for the longer term for children. It's absolutely crucial. So I set out on a ridiculous journey to track children through from 3 to 18. And I'm just finishing the final write-up of it. At the end of this month, I've got to be able to draw a line. So that's great. And then there'll be a study in Scotland of 14 years of school experience and what happens afterwards. They're 25. So it's fascinating to know what happened next. Great. Okay, nearly there. So one of the concepts that surfaces is, and I talked about this kind of space that's there in between, and I didn't read you, Dewey. Can I quickly find it? I maybe turned it. On discontinuity and continuity, don't go back. No, because it's not in there. Dewey was writing and publishing in the 30s through to the 60s. And what he said about continuity was the principle of continuity of experience means that every experience both takes up something from those which have gone before and modifies in some way the quality of those experiences that come afterwards. And I think that catches it for me. And so we need to look back and see what people were writing and see if it's still relevant then. So the spaces in between, I think this is about, what we need to do, building community, rethinking transitions. And these are the titles we have in the position statement that you'll see tomorrow: entitlements, opportunities, participation, aspirations, expectations, contribution, and participation. Engaging with policy, changes in role. I like the concept of multiple belongings. Children just don't need to be suitable with us. They need to have that sense of belonging wherever they are, and so do we. I hope you're feeling you belong here. And reflecting on that, I think transitions just are ubiquitous. They start as our lives start, and they go right on to the very end. My old mum at 95 said, I think it's time you wrote about transitions into old age. And she was an early childhood teacher, but time you did, and especially transitions after you've had a stroke, she said to me. What a determined lady. And so I don't think the child functions in isolation of the model that we hold of them. So we really have to reflect on, are we allowing our model of a child to grow and change, to move from the developmental to the socio-cultural, to embracing the family and the community? Is that me? Oh, so why are we still studying transitions? Well, I think that it's possible they marginalise people who are already disadvantaged. I've heard various people talk about that. They may interrupt relationships and learning and development and well-being. They shouldn't here, because we have a curriculum that helps us not interrupt. Systems have remained largely unchanged in structure. We need to rethink that. I think it's harder to develop mutual perspectives if the systems aren't continuous. And children's perspectives, families being positioned on the outside and maybe not collectively valuing transitions as tools for change. And you've got 4 pages of references after that, so you'll be able to find everything. I think that was the last one, wasn't it? Not bad for me.
Done.
You don't have questions.